Hello, my name is Cole Anderson. Today's piece is the Piano Sonata in A-flat major by Richard Wagner. If you like what I'm doing on this channel, please consider making a donation to my Patreon account, which is linked in the description box below. Donations help me to continue to bring you this content, and any amount is vastly appreciated, so thank you. Richard Wagner is not a composer who is usually associated with the piano. He's probably most famous for his tetralogy of operas, Der Ring des Nibelungen, which incidentally was undoubtedly an inspiration for Tolkien's famous novel, The Lord of the Rings. Most of Wagner's compositional effort went into his so-called music of the future, the combination of drama, poetry, music, and stagecraft into one cohesive, total artwork. From a philosophical viewpoint, Wagner considered standard forms like the sonata to be outdated, as they could not easily be adapted to the uses of drama and poetry. The sonata form is self-contained in musical logic, and therefore seems to exclude the use of non-musical elements. It's likely that Wagner considered this piece, along with other piano pieces that he wrote in the 1850s and 60s, to be merest trifles, and used them as thank you presents for his patrons and friends. In this case, he wrote the sonata in an album belonging to Mathilde Wessendonck, whose husband Otto had been aiding Wagner with financial support since 1852. Despite his dismissive feelings about these old, so-called outdated forms, the work is, simply put, a masterpiece. Wagner, in fact, was quite infatuated with Mathilde Wessendonck, and she was a major influence on his work on Tristan und Isolde, and on the music of the Ring Cycle, which Wagner began writing in the 1850s. They were able to see eye to eye on philosophy and music, and their discussions were very stimulating for Wagner's creativity. Among other things, the song cycle, the Wessendonck Lieder, were also written for Mathilde and based on her poetry. Like in the Wessendonck Lieder, there are some clear thematic presentiments of Tristan to be found in this piece. The opening theme, for one, is strikingly similar to the motive that Wagner would use in Tristan some years later. It famously opens the Liebestod. And then there's also this motive in the second theme, which also closely resembles a motive from Tristan. In addition to that, though, Wagner also does some things with the form that shows that he was closely familiar with the work of the Viennese classical tradition, Mozart, Haydn, Schubert, and Beethoven first and foremost. One very extraordinary thing that Wagner does is to reverse the order that the thematic material is presented in the recapitulation. So, to explain that a bit, usually a sonata form work will be outlined like this, with an exposition with several thematic areas in different keys. So usually it starts in the home key or tonic, moving to the dominant, or 5. Although movement by thirds was also common by the mid-19th century. After that, there would be a development of the material from the exposition, and following that, a recapitulation. Now, all the material from the exposition would be repeated, but in the home key. So this would create a sense of resolution to the form. Instead, Wagner begins the recapitulation in a different key, in the subdominant, which was a technique which is used sometimes in the classical period. Schubert did it sometimes, and all the other composers like Beethoven and Haydn used it occasionally. The other thing that he does, which is unusual, is he starts with the second thematic group, so he skips the opening theme at first altogether. And then also, the unrest of the development section kind of seeps into the recapitulation material, so it's almost as if we're not really certain that we're back to home ground yet. But finally, he does bring the music back around to the home key of A-flat major in time to recap the first theme. In this way, Wagner creates a kind of grand arch shape to the structure, which is remarkably satisfying. This manner of structuring a sonata form piece goes back to earlier classical masters like Haydn in the mid-18th century, but was very uncommon by this time. So this takes us on to the topic of Wagner, the pianist. Wagner was not a virtuoso pianist at all, although he could certainly get around the piano perfectly well. In writing this piece, he found many beautiful solutions to pianistic problems. The only place where his inspiration failed him a little is in the most difficult section, which is the development section. And he was obviously a little bit at a loss here. He relies a little too much on simple, repetitive left-hand arpeggios, just repeating them again and again. It isn't possible to fix this either without really changing the musical idea behind it, because the arpeggios are motivic. They connect to something in the exposition. But towards the end of this passage, I do fill out the right-hand harmonies in a way which I feel more fully brings the passage to life and offsets the slightly monotonous left-hand figuration. Of course, this brings up a very controversial point. To what extent should a performing musician feel at liberty to alter a composer's text? Not too long ago, it would have been considered arrogant in the extreme for a performer to alter the music that they were playing in any way. And not so long ago, really, because I've encountered that myself many times, where teachers have slapped me down a little bit for making alterations, which I felt were justified, with no other reason than just that the score didn't say it that way. Many times people are surprised to learn that this tradition of textual precision is a recent innovation. Its full flowering can really be traced back to the post-World War II period. But the stage was set for it earlier in the 20th century by composers like Mahler, Schoenberg, and Stravinsky. All these composers were very meticulous about notating their scores, almost obsessive about every little detail. Stravinsky, for one, famously referred to performers as soldiers and composers as the officers, to be obeyed without question or hesitation. This approach among pianists was expressed by performing musicians like the great Soviet pianist Sviatoslav Richter, when he said that a performer should be a mirror of the score, not adding or removing anything that comes from themselves. In a way, such an attitude is highly laudable, and it's certainly respectful, but I oftentimes wonder to what degree such an approach has any basis in being used in the music of centuries before the 20th. Improvisation and embellishment were well-known practices throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, and improvisation was still very prevalent during the 19th as well. Certainly recordings by artists who were born in the 19th century, like Rachmaninoff, Alfred Cortot, Paderewski, and Ignaz Friedman, are oftentimes strikingly freewheeling in the way they treat the score. They sometimes alter dynamics, tempi, pacing, and even notes, but usually always remaining within the spirit of the music. This kind of approach requires not only a lot of depth and knowledge, but it also requires not inconsiderable daring. When I listen to these kinds of recordings, I'm oftentimes amazed at the originality of what these artists do. They contribute to the score as if it were a living thing. I don't always agree, but I admire their understanding of the music that allows them to treat it as such a living, flexible medium. And I often think it's a shame that classical instrumentalists learned to be such literalists, to be so frightened of making the slightest alteration in the scores that they perform. We maybe lost more than we gained with our obsession with exact score reproduction, egged on by recordings, as if we, as human beings, were some kind of sound photocopiers, instead of aiming to breathe life into the music first and foremost. I always refer back to two quotes from famous musicians from the 19th century. The first is Anton Rubinstein's famous dictum, to first learn the music exactly as written, and then when you are certain that you have done complete justice to everything in the score, and you still feel the need to make an alteration, do so. Also, food for thought is this famous quote from Franz Liszt on the role of a recreative artist. For the virtuoso, musical works are in fact nothing but tragic and moving materializations of his emotions. He is called upon to make them speak, weep, sing, and sigh, to recreate them in accordance with his own consciousness. In this way, he, like the composer, is a creator, for he must have within himself those passions that he wishes to bring so intensely to life. So please be sure to comment if you have any thoughts on this topic. It's possible to debate it endlessly, and there's no right answer, at least not according to me. So thank you. Hope you enjoyed the performance.